Carol, you were my first sister in arms in working around this issue. So it's really a delight to be able to take this time to pull some wisdom out of that big head and heart that you have, but also reflect a little bit together on some of what we've learned in the years now that we have had our paths crossing around supporting survivors of abuse by Buddhist teachers. And Zen Buddhism started facing its reckoning a couple of decades ago,
Yes.
but there's a sense that this is really just starting to happen within Tibetan Buddhism. There have been more and more allegations that are coming forward, and those of us and someone like you who have spoken publicly or have known to have served as allies or advocates to survivors are approached by many more survivors, many of whom will tell their stories but are not ready to make them public. And obviously, as someone who came out of retirement in order to work initially pro bono with the Shambhala survivors for the Buddhist Sunshine Project, and now someone who is part of a legal practice that is specifically focusing on accountability for survivors of abuse by Buddhist and yoga teachers, you hear a lot of stories of survivors, and any one of us who's working on this will. And so many of those are held in confidence. So you will have a much bigger sense of the scope.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful for me to be here talking with you and reflecting about some of the ways that we have worked together in the past. So I think it's always important to recognize that, as in any religion, um, there are teachings that benefit people. It's the abuses of power, I think, is where we see the reckoning coming. You mentioned in the Zen community some decades ago, and I really do feel that the reckoning now is coming for Buddhism.
So let's think a bit about the legal piece.
Yes.
Just kind of locate the lawsuits that are discussed or are actually filed and pursued within a community-wide response to allegations of abuse. And I want to think a little bit together about what is the place of these lawsuits in preventing abuse, in addressing abuse, and
Mhm.
then in healing. I want to start before that in thinking a little bit about the experience that was our first situation that we addressed together, which was when the series of allegations against Dagri Rinpoche, a very important teacher in the FPMT, were made public when he was arrested for sexually molesting a woman in India, and then another video adding to the allegations. And then I was approached by a number of women who had also been assaulted or abused by him in something that happened over the course of a decade. And what we sought was an independent investigation as what the women wanted to have happen first. And we made a sort of ultimatum at a certain point in conversations with the board when we had some concerns whether or not they were going to do that. And the ultimatum was, you have until this time to hire someone to do an investigation, or we will either take it public or initiate legal action. And that started the independent investigation. But then we came to the conclusion of what was, for the survivors, a quite re-traumatizing process of having to talk again and again about their experiences. And at the end of that time, the results of the independent investigation were given to the FPMC, and they were not taking steps to publish those results. And at that time, you consulted a contract lawyer, and finally one of the things that prompted them to finally make the investigation public was when it turned out that actually another legal action could be taken against them. So just to get the independent investigation done and published, this fear of legal action was an incredibly powerful tool.
Yes.
And mhm. And so there are more and more civil cases that actually are coming out, not just being discussed or mentioned. And I just would like to hear from you what you think about the legal piece. I was there in case we were going to go public, and you were there in case we were going to go legal. And you were the one whose tools of the trade actually moved things forward, I think, primarily. And so I wonder if you could reflect on how that worked and how that helps to prevent or address.
Well, so I that it's such an interesting question, which is the role of the law and the legal system in these kinds of situations. So I think back to not that long ago in United States history and the civil rights laws. So the Civil Rights Acts were that you cannot discriminate against people on the basis of race. In addition, at that time, it was gender. It has been expanded over the years to include ethnic origin, to include disability, to include religion. All of those things are part of what you could think of as people's civil rights, but particularly it has affected the workplace. So before that time, you I practiced law in Boston for a time, and it was always said, in an earlier period of time before the Civil Rights Act, it would not be uncommon to see a sign in a store window, help wanted, Irish need not apply. And so it didn't matter whether it was race or ethnic origin or gender. Before 1964, there was nothing that could be done about these abuses and discrimination. And so after 1964, we see some traction, we see things change, we see organizations like businesses begin to um, uh, kind of uh, adjust their thinking and understand what they can and cannot do. And that's what the law has done in that area. In my own legal practice, I saw that in the early 90s, we saw a woman come forward and accuse a man of sexual harassment who was being nominated to be a Supreme Court judge, so the highest court in the land. And we had a very large conversation as a country about that situation. Until that time, it was in the early 90s, I was practicing law in Massachusetts. We had never had a case of sexual harassment. There had never been one. In fact, the first Supreme Court case was in 1986 on sexual harassment. And by the end of the 90s, in the early 2000s, I had done sexual harassment training, sometimes 2 or 3 times, in other words, every 2 years, for corporations in the United States, because they understood that there are risks involved in engaging in the behavior that they had once engaged in with impunity. And so I look to that to say that the role of the law is to help all organizations, but in this case, religious organizations, understand that they are not above the law, that there are laws in place. And being involved in a lawsuit, whether you are a plaintiff or a defendant, meaning whether you are bringing the suit or whether you are the organization that's being sued, it is a very painful process. And it is very painful for organizations. And I think that we have not had enough of a reckoning so that organizations could look, as corporate America has done, and said, what is the law? How do I need to abide by it? And it's applied to corporate America, but a kind of Buddhist America has not done a good job of understanding what the law is and that it applies to them. There is a certain insularity that happens that um, lulls people into an idea that these things are okay and that they're not subject to the law, but that's not the case. So first of all, I think that yes, the law, um, kind of, people think of it sometimes as if it has a negative. In other words, it's like a big stick. But I think there's a role for the big stick. I think the role is to say, not only to the person who's being sued or the organization that's being sued or the community that's being sued, I think it is also for those outside of it to learn without having to do without having to be sued. In other words, we should all be able to learn from the mistakes of others. And I think that's one thing
Mhm.
that the law has done for us. And I see it in the Civil Rights Act, in race and gender, and all of those categories, as well as in sexual harassment, where the law has taught us where we need to be, or else we're going to take the consequences.
So this is particularly speaking to preventing.
Yes,
Then we look at the cases where, horses out of the barn,
right.
the abuse has been going on for a long time. In what way do civil cases help to bring about some sort of movement towards accountability, towards transparency, towards facing what has happened?
Well, of course, what it is, the court process is a transparency process in a certain way. In a certain way, we put out what we believe are the claims, what our clients tell us has happened to them. We see that these things violate the law. We see that there has been coercion or there has been non-consent, no possibility of consent. And so we put that out as the lawyers for the survivors, and then the organization has to answer that. They literally have to answer. And then after they answer, then we get to go into some kind of a period of discovery and we get the opportunity to prove our case. So I think there is a kind, to me, that's a kind of reckoning right there, because you have to answer to the legal system. You have to answer to the court. You have to answer to the people who are suing you. You have to answer to the lawyers who are behind all of it. And so it is things, the way that I think of it is that things that have gone on in the dark have a light shined on them so that everyone can see. So a court case, a complaint, is a public document in the United States, which means that anybody can go and they can read it. And to me, that is the kind of light that needs to be put on what has been happening in the dark, literally and figuratively. It's been happening in a bubble. It's been happening behind closed doors in isolation. Um, and it's brought into the light. So I think that there is that. But I think the other thing about the actual legal process, other than prevention, as you said, that as that train has already left the station, when they're already involved in a lawsuit. And I can't say that this is the case for everyone, but I do think that there are many of our clients who would have at some point or another not been willing to be involved in litigation, but as things have moved on, they have changed that perspective. They've become involved in litigation, and many of them find that the process of shining that light and the process of being heard often has come after a long period of being silenced, of being told, no, that isn't what you think it was. You weren't raped. That was the guru. That was the guru's grace. That was mixing minds. That was, a lot of different things, whatever you call it. It's finally someone saying, no, that wasn't right. You were right. That wasn't okay, what happened to you. So I think being listened to, first of all, by your own lawyers, and then having an opportunity to tell your story in the transparency of the court proceedings, it's empowering. A lot of our clients feel that they've gotten their voices back, even though it's been difficult to be in litigation.
Mhm. Can you say a little bit about how survivors of rape or abuse find themselves better served by civil than criminal cases?
Uh,
Because this
Yes,
is always a question,
yes,
why aren't they getting this guy behind bars? Why are they
right.
looking for money, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's great for people to understand. So, of course, in the United States, there are two tracks, right? There's the track that's the criminal track, and there's the track that's the civil track. They are run in different ways, and they have different outcomes at the end. So over here we have the criminal track. It's not handled by lawyers like me. It's handled by district attorneys who are literally servants of society. So they decide, these are laws that we have decided as a society that we want. Which one of the many things that comes in front of me do I choose to take to court and to litigate? And in the area of rape and sexual assault, the criminal justice system, for a lot of different reasons, has an abysmal record. There are not that many rape cases that make it to trial. And let me give you an example of a case. So, a woman was raped. Now, this is not a religious community. This happened in another situation. And of course, rape is something that doesn't really usually have witnesses. And so, but in this case, there were witnesses because the woman was being raped in an alley while she was unconscious. Um, and the district attorney took up the case. So there are a number of hurdles in the criminal justice system. You have to go to the police. The police have to investigate. Then maybe they take it to a grand jury, a district attorney does, and they have to decide that they're going to take that case. And then they have to decide whether they're going to take it to trial or whether they're going to allow the alleged perpetrator to plead out in some way. Maybe the district attorney sees a flaw in the case. He or she doesn't believe that they can win it. The case of the woman that I'm speaking of, she did go to trial. She went over all of those hurdles. She went to trial, and the jury found that she had been raped. And so it was an unbelievably rigorous process for her. But at the end of it, a jury decided that they heard her voice, that they heard her story. But the judge, when it got to sentencing, said something like, I don't want to ruin this young man's life. And so I'm going to give him probation. I can't imagine the pain for a survivor to have told her story that many times to have that be the outcome. So that's the criminal justice system, lots of hurdles. And at the end, the outcome is the person may go to jail. That's it. It does not address the organization that enabled the perpetrator to do this, because an organization can't be put in jail. And the second thing is that it doesn't address reparations for the harm done to the survivor. The states sometimes have funds that can go to survivors, but basically there's no reparation scheme. Now, on the civil side, survivors are represented by their own lawyers. So my clients are represented by me. I have an ethical duty to do what they feel is in their best interest. If they want to settle a case, then those are my directions. If they want to go to trial, those are my directions. So things don't get settled out without your voice being at the table. The other part about the civil justice system that I just referred to in opposition to the criminal justice system is that it is possible to sue the organization. It is possible to sue the perpetrator and the organization. It is possible to sue the organization when the perpetrator is dead. It is possible to sue both of them or just one of them. And so I think that for survivors, they often feel, and they have told me, that the organization caused as much pain as the perpetrator did, often because they've been silenced, they've been shunned, they've been retaliated against, they've been thrown out of the community. And so they often want for there to be a light on the actions of the organization that enabled all of this to happen. And if you think of it um, from the perspective of trying to eliminate this behavior, suing just the perpetrator when the organization knew about it and allowed it to go on doesn't do anything for society. It doesn't, it allows the organization to continue to do what they were doing before, which is what we're trying to stop. And so I think from a social and societal perspective, it makes a lot of sense to allow organizations to understand that they cannot let teachers, gurus, swamis, whatever they are, to engage in this conduct because they will be liable as well. So that's the kind of difference between the two systems. You don't have to do one or the other. You can use the criminal justice system at the same time that you use the civil justice system. But the civil justice system at the end, the outcome we hope for is reparations for the harm that has been done, which often involves therapy, medical, all kinds of things that are part of the harm that has been caused. And in addition, sometimes things, non-financial things like apologies, acknowledgments, changes to the organization, those things are all possible in the civil justice system.
Mhm. So it sounds like you've been addressing the question of how does this help bring about some healing.
Yes.
There's a sense in which during the experience of abuse, one's voice is silenced, one's autonomy is denied. And what you describe in the criminal system is a very high risk of that happening again. And so the civil case giving this opportunity that the lawyer will follow the instructions and there will be consent that is honored and there will be autonomy that is really affirmed and exercised in the civil case. So I can see how that element of it could be very healing. And you're talking about the role of the institution, and I think if we shift to talk a little bit about this whole sense in which the institution, the organization's handling of allegations has tended to re-traumatize, and as you mentioned,
Yes.
can be more damaging, more psychologically devastating, even than the abuse itself. And so in the case of institutional betrayal, what you have is the same, the voice again is ignored and the autonomy is denied, and once again there is this sort of violation of the person that takes place. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you've heard or seen the impact of the institutional or organizational complicity? How do those who are supporting an abusive lama compound the harm or escalate the trauma?
I'm not a psychologist, but my experience with with survivors is that you've had this experience, this trauma that has happened to you. And so the trauma is there, and then you reveal it to the organization, and they not only ignore it, but they often throw you out of the community that you were a part of, that you should have been able, where you would have expected to have gotten support. So it's trauma on trauma. And so it's like there's probably a mathematical formula that applies here. It's like squared. It's not, it's not like just two traumas. It's an original trauma that is then made worse. It's an open wound that then has some kind of poison poured into it. And it is absolutely betrayal. And there's nothing worse than that. That to be betrayed by a person that you trusted, that was a trusted spiritual leader to you, and then to be betrayed by your community. These are very, these are unbelievable traumas for people.
I want to go back and ask one question because it's something that comes up quite a lot, which is when you're accepting a case,
Mhm.
when your law firm decides to accept a case, what is the level of certainty in the truth of the allegations that you need to have? Because people often, when these lawsuits are being made public, often they'll say, well, you can allege anything, people can claim any falsity in a lawsuit. So when you're accepting a case, and I do note that the law firm that you are working for, McAllister Olivarius, was founded by Ann Olivarius, who's has an international, an internationally respected lawyer who's worked on issues benefiting women and girls, and has been praised by Nelson Mandela, who she consulted with on South Africa's issues. And so I sort of wonder whether, first, I also just on a personal level wonder how much that was a factor in your deciding to come out of retirement to be able to work with someone who had that level of respect and gravitas. But also just, you know, are there cases you don't take because you are not able to put forward the same level of certainty?
My coming out of retirement is because I've absolutely failed at retirement. And so there's just, it's all failure with me in retirement. And so when I met Anne, yes, she is a force of nature, and she has a very strong conviction about human rights. And I had been doing the investigations pro bono, as you said, but what I saw was that there was not going to be any accountability for the organizations themselves. So maybe Dagri Rinpoche is not teaching for FPMT anymore, but there's been no accounting for whether FPMT was aware of what he was doing long ago and turned a blind eye. And so that reckoning hasn't really happened. And the reckoning of the organizations, we just didn't see that much success with telling people this is happening in your organization. That's what we were doing, right? We were doing investigations, and we were showing them the corroborating evidence, the kind of thing that you're talking about would be needed in court. And we had limited success, and then complete failures where organizations just didn't care. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to be accountable for their own institutional betrayal. So when I met Anne, um, it was involving another case, and um, I met her, and I immediately felt the passion that she brings to this kind of cases. And so I asked her if she would, if we found plaintiffs, would she be interested in taking these cases? And she absolutely was. And that's how we got started. Eventually, she asked me if I would come on board. And the first thing I said to her is, "I'm old." Really? And the second thing was, what do you want me to do? And she said, "I want you to build a practice group based around sexual assaults, sexual abuse in spiritual communities." And I thought, that's a pretty gutsy play for a law firm. But that's the way this law firm is. And it is the case that I wouldn't be at any other law firm, because this is a law firm that respects survivor-oriented procedures, and also understands trauma. We train everyone that works with us. We have trauma-informed training. We pay attention to the vicarious trauma that all of us who are working in this field also carry, because we have to care for ourselves in order to care for others. And so, yeah, Anne is and Jeff McAllister, the two of them together. So you asked me about the level of evidence, and there's lots of cases where there may be obstacles to the legal system, to even getting to the door of the courthouse. And those are cases that we can't take, because we don't want to put a survivor through the process of litigation if we believe we are going to lose, because it's not good for the survivor and it's not good for the law firm. On the other hand, I have seen cases where we've taken a risk, where we've said, we know that this is true, but sometimes the time limit has passed for people to be able to bring a case. And sometimes there are cases where there isn't a claim, because it's outside the kind of narrow boundaries of the law. I say every day, the law doesn't give us the tools that we need to fight this kind of abuse. So we use what we have, and we take a lot of risks, and often they pay off, in the sense that we find other people who've had the same thing happen to them, which is very good corroborating evidence. Often the organizations know that it has happened, and they may not want to stand up in front of a jury and talk about their conduct. So, yes, there are cases that we cannot take. Yes, there are cases that maybe we take not exactly knowing how they are going to pan out, but we take the risk on a lot of cases. And it is a risk, by the way, because we take cases on a contingency fee. So if the client, the survivor, does not have to pay anything until they receive a settlement or a judgment.
I want to think about those situations in which the the survivor has their hearing by their lawyers and they receive compensation because there's an out-of-court settlement
Mhm.
where maybe a non-disclosure agreement gets signed, which does happen, and no one is the wiser except the accountants and the board of that organization, who've sold off some assets or come up with the money to pay off that settlement. And actually, this allows that teacher potentially to continue having access to other people. Their reputation is intact. They basically, yes, they've lost some financial resources, but that's much more replaceable than reputation or, jail time,
Yes.
right? And so the ethics of having cases in which the faithful who have given their donations to that organization, their money is used to pay, legal fees and to pay off the situation, and there isn't any public accountability and there isn't any transparency. So how does that work here? How does that fit in?
It's a very interesting and difficult situation. So let's talk about non-disclosure agreements. Um, Non-disclosure agreements mean that you sign that you are not going to speak about. And there's a continuum of non-disclosure agreement possibilities. But the one at this end of the spectrum that you're talking about is where if I take the money for the settlement, then I sign that I can never speak about this. At the other end of the spectrum, there are non-disclosure agreements that say, okay, I'm not going to tell how much money I received. I'm not going to tell the amount, but I can talk about anything else. So there is a spectrum, first of all, within non-disclosure agreements, but non-disclosure agreements, and I think this is a situation that is receiving more kind of light being put on it, are really against public policy for exactly the reasons that you've said. Because if you can continue to hide this, then it is very possible that you're just going to continue to engage in the same behavior, both as a perpetrator and as an organization. Now, here's how this works in the United States. The decision to sign a non-disclosure agreement is completely up to the client. So there is, if a client says to me, I will not sign a non-disclosure agreement, then that is what we are going to go in with and negotiate. If a client says, I will not sign a non-disclosure agreement, and we get into negotiations in a settlement, and they say, just for the sake of discussion, I'm going to give you $100. That's a small round number. But you need to sign a non-disclosure. And the client says, no, I'm not going to sign it. And then we go back and say, no, I'm not going to sign it. Then the amount goes down, because part of what we're seeing in the US is people are buying silence. And if you're not going to be silent, then they don't want to spend that much money on you, And so it really becomes a point at which the client, the survivor, has to determine what is in their best interest. And yes, it would be in society's best interest if our clients did not sign a non-disclosure agreement, but it would also be easier for the legislatures to outlaw them, in which case they would never be on the table. We would never have to negotiate it down. People would be weighing, these organizations would be weighing the risk of going in front of a jury instead of a non-disclosure agreement as part of the deal. So I'm not a fan of non-disclosure agreements, but I take my instructions from my clients because survivors are also individual people who are in different kinds of situations in their lives. And at the current time, the law gives them the opportunity to decide whether they want to remain silent or not.
So there's also a medium ground, and it's one case that your law firm has put into the public realm in the form of a complaint, and that is the case of 4 decades of abuse by Lama Norla, a Karma Kagyu teacher in upstate New York. So there's a case against his organization that you've put, Kagyu Tupten Choling, which is now Palpung Tupten Choling, because Lama Norla, the alleged predator or abuser, has passed away, and that center is now headed by Taisito Rinpoche. So in this case, instead of approaching their lawyers quietly and saying, hey, look at all the things that have been done and these are all your liabilities and let's have a conversation, you filed a legal complaint that is in the public domain in the New York State court system, and it's been, reported on in the press. And so that's a way in which, although, you may be moving towards an out of court settlement that may or may not ever be disclosed publicly, the allegations did make it in some sense into the public realm. And that's one of the reasons why I'm asking, like, what is the level of certainty? Like, how confident are you in the veracity of the allegations before you accept a case? Because all of those allegations, which are just absolutely devastating just to read and unimaginable to actually experience, are detailing, one of the plaintiffs had had been going from person to person trying to get someone in authority to do something about it, and had told Taisi Rinpoche, according to this complaint, and allegedly also told Mingyur Rinpoche, and she was told, like, we're not going to make a big deal out of it. He's a good person. Lama Norla, the alleged abuser, is a good person. And so, this paints this picture in which the organization knew, people in authority knew. It also describes allegedly members of the board having been told and having pressured various women to continue, you know, allowing or, experiencing this form of sexual assault and not going public about it, not, holding consequences. So can you, I know there's probably limitations on what you can say, but the putting into the public domain of these allegations against an organization, can you tell me, what the thinking was or the strategy was behind that?
Yeah. So again, we take our instructions from our clients. And so our clients wanted to file a lawsuit. And so we filed a lawsuit. A lawsuit is public. And so, yes, press organizations have picked it up. Um, as part of the strategy is that in this particular case, which I think is interesting, maybe for your viewers, is that the state of New York had opened what we call a revival window. So, in order to explain that, I need to step back one step and say that all of these states have what are called statutes of limitations. That is a limitation period within which you can bring a claim. Now, in this case, um, in New York, the legislature opened a revival window for children first, called the Child Survivors Act. It was open for 2 years, just a couple of years ago, and they opened a window for adults. So that means if you were over the age of 18 when you were assaulted, and it met the criteria of a couple of different criminal statutes, that you were allowed to bring what is an old claim. And so for two of the three plaintiffs in that case, their cases had long ago expired under the statutes of limitations at the time. And so for them to proceed, it needed to be filed in court. So, there, in some cases, we do approach an organization to find out if they are interested in settlement. We send them a letter in advance and we lay out the claims. But in this case, it had to be filed because the process of getting to the door of the courthouse required that we do that. And that was also it was the desire of the survivors that it be known, so that there could be meaningful change. And when we're talking here, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever seen any of these higher level Buddhist teachers ever be disciplined or removed, other than Dagri Rinpoche, for uh, assaulting? I've never seen it. I don't know of a single situation, and maybe I wouldn't know, so maybe it exists. But what I would say is, I don't know of any situation in which a Lama Norla would have been removed from his position or disciplined in some way by the organization for any kind of wrongdoing. I don't think it happens.
So how will getting organizations like Pelpum Tsupten Chuling to either to court or to the point where they need to pay vast amounts of money to stay out of court, which is probably, you know, what everyone is going to want, because you don't want this dragged into a public sphere like that. How is that going to serve to hold organizations and teachers accountable?
The organizations, I don't think they want to change. I don't think going to them and saying, we'd like you to change, we think this is wrong, is actually having an effect. I say that because for 4 years, that's what I did. And it was not successful because the organizations don't want to change. And so now what I feel is that now we have to utilize the next tool that we have, which for me is the legal system. And we have to say, okay, so you don't want to change. So now we're going to strongly encourage you to change by negatively impacting your public image and your bank account, so that maybe donors will think twice about contributing money unless you change.
So we've talked about the trauma to survivors, both of the abuse by someone in whom they've placed all of their trust spiritually, psychologically. So there's that trauma. There's also the trauma of all the psychological manipulation and coercion, either through Buddhist doctrines, through community pressure, that they've had to undergo the grooming to get to the point where they are being abused in that way. So there's that trauma, and the civil cases have their place in recovering their voice and helping bring about some healing and regaining autonomy and getting resources for the years of therapy that we know is going to be required for that. So, you know, how survivors are served in their healing process by these civil cases, how could these civil cases help to address some of the secondary trauma that an entire community experiences, which, you know, just to emphasize, it is not the same and it is not as acute
Yes.
as what the survivors experience directly, but there is, and I've seen it all over the place, there is a terrible psychological and spiritual devastation, a crisis of faith, and a secondary trauma of learning that you have entrusted yourself fully to someone capable of rape and assault, or that you have put yourself and made yourself vulnerable in a space thinking it was safe, when you suddenly become aware that it is very far from safe. And, you know, women who have been taught very early on in life that, you know, that you have to be careful not to, you know, be anywhere that you might potentially be raped or assaulted, to learn that not only did you knowingly walk into that kind of a situation, that maybe you also, you know, vouched for the abuser, you invited your friends and family to come into that space. So the second guessing, the crisis of faith, the loss of trust, in what way can these cases, you know, be a healing for that?
That's a very good question that I really do not have an adequate answer for. So here's what I will tell you in is my experience, that in the same way that survivors can regain their voice, not just through the legal system, but through speaking out. Even people who are not willing to be involved in a lawsuit, or don't have the opportunity because the law doesn't give us, endless amounts of time to file these cases. We know that statutes of limitations are too short, that it takes us years to process what has happened in these situations. So the only thing that I know is that in a number of my cases, I have seen the community, while it has been devastated by these charges, and while it has been divided by the charges, that there are people within who step forward and say, I was duped, or I never knew that that was happening, but now my own ethical and moral, grounding tells me that I want to stand with survivors. And to me, that can be a very healing process, to be able to say, I didn't know, but I'm not going to be involved with it anymore. Or I'm not going to allow the organization to make uh, ugly statements about the survivors in a narrative that is completely wrong. I'm going to stand up and face the reality, and I'm going to, tell me what I can do. I have people come to me that say, tell me what I can do to support these people, these survivors that are standing up and doing a job, in essence. They are taking a role that society needs them to take. And they do it at great expense to themselves in many circumstances. And so I don't know that that's the answer. I don't know. I know that communities are devastated by these charges. But I also believe, and I think Buddhists believe, in reality. And if the reality is that we have communities that are based on lies, that are based on abuses of power, then even though it may hurt the community, that in the end, that's what we have to go for. We have to go for the truth. I think that there's even what is it? The lion's roar. It's the truth. And so if these things are true, then the community can be strengthened by facing the truth, dealing with it, making change, making sure it doesn't happen again.
And you're there in the front lines, encouraging slash requiring them to do so.
We hope so, because here is the fear that I have. I have to tell you, Damsha, that somewhere on Reddit, somebody said that it was my personal mission to destroy Buddhism in the West. And I thought, no, in fact, I think it's just the opposite. I think that it's my personal mission to uphold Dharma. Buddhism is not about abusing other people. Buddhism is not about harming people. None of this is what I think, and I certainly am not a Buddhist scholar, but it is not what I believe that the Buddhist religion is about, any more than the Christian religion is, or the Catholic faith is about assaulting boys and children. I don't believe that's the religion. I believe that by calling out and forcing a reckoning and hoping for change, that upholds Dharma, so that we don't see the kind of reckoning that the Catholic Church has had to have, where when you hear the words Catholic Church, you think about sexual assault of children. I don't want it to be the same for Buddhism. I would like for people to learn and to change so that people can go and study and be in retreats and in monasteries and whatever they are safely. I believe that is compassion. Thank you for having me, for allowing me to speak to your viewers. I appreciate it.
Thank you for all your work, for all you're doing, and for the wisdom that you're offering here, complementing that compassion. Thank you.